Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. It's great to have you all with us. Today, whether you're sitting in South Africa or whether you are already abroad, today's webinar is just for you. So today we're going to be chatting a bit about the consequences of your tax affairs and what's required when you leave South Africa and what's required with regards to SARS as well on exit out of South Africa. Hosting you today is going to be myself and Victoria. We've done this for many years, so I've got extensive expertise in this area. If you've got any questions during the webinar, just pop them in the chat box. We do have Melissa from SAIL who is monitoring that for us. At the end of the session, we're going to answer all your questions. And then also at the end of the session, if you want to unmute yourself, if you want to turn your cameras on and ask your questions live, we will answer those for you. We're going to jump right in and start with the polling questions. So Victoria or Melissa, if you could get that up for us. It's a two-part question. The first part is just about where you are thinking of going to or where you are already at. And then the second part is whether you are sitting in South Africa or whether you are already abroad. Just while we get that question up, I think it's just important to say that often when someone's thinking of immigrating or when you immigrate, you think about schooling for your children, climate, job opportunity. And I think the last thing on your list, or sometimes it doesn't even feature, is your tax affairs with SARS and also your tax affairs in your new jurisdiction. And I think it's so important. We do like a proactive approach where people come to us before they've left so we can mitigate those tax liabilities. But often we also have people who come to us where they've gone for 10, 20 years and need to sort their SARS affairs out. Last year, Victoria, we did one where I think it's one of the oldest ones we've done. Victoria, do you want to tell us a bit about how far back you've gone?
Yeah, so this one, probably the longest, furthest back that I've gone is to 1986. Way before we were even a tax residency-based system. We became a tax residency-based system in 2001. So having to go that far back as 1986 seems a bit outrageous and maybe unnecessary. The reason for these guys was they had an inheritance coming their way from South Africa, and they needed to show to SARS and to the attorneys that were handing out the inheritance that they were in fact South African non-residents to be able to receive the funds abroad. So we had to go all the way back. Luckily, they had all their documents and all their proof. But yeah, that's the furthest back we've gone, 30, almost 40 years back. We do often go backwards, so don't be scared for those of you that have left long ago but had your head in the sand, like Erin said. I think we're struggling a little bit with the poll, so we'll carry on and have the poll up in a little bit.
So the poll is up. I'm just going to end the poll now. I think majority of people have answered, and I'll just share the results. Right, so we've got 67% in the UK, 11% in Australia, Canada, we've got 11%, and other, we've got 22%. Other places people are going to that's not listed is often Netherlands, Poland, all over, Mozambique, Mauritius, and 38% have left, and 63% are still thinking about leaving.
Interesting. Good to know where everyone is. And interestingly enough, that everyone is in the UK. We actually, half of our office is based in the UK. So we can help you guys on that side with tax pays as well, just so you're aware. But yeah, Mozambique, that's also a nice one that we recently found that there's a large community of South Africans, and you would think it's logical because it is right next door. But yeah, it's not the first place that you think of people immigrating to.
And then just before we jump into the webinar, just a bit of a disclaimer. So today we are doing a high-level overview of tax immigration. Each scenario is case-specific, so do reach out to us for professional advice for your specific case and scenario so we can help you in detail.
Right, so let's jump in a little bit with why we're doing this webinar and what we're going to be discussing. I think a good way to go about this is let's talk about a few misconceptions and myths of what people understand about exiting South Africa and tax. So let's jump into it. The first myth is that spending more than 183 days out of South Africa automatically means you're a tax non-resident.
So this one is incorrect. So that specific 183-day rule is around a specific exemption. It doesn't mean that you're no longer tax resident in South Africa. It's just a specific relief that you can apply against your foreign income.
That doesn't automatically mean you're tax non-resident. Great. Myth busted.
Second myth is ceasing tax residency means no more South African tax obligations.
Hey, let's see. The reality of this one is that, unfortunately, even if you do break your tax residency, you do still have obligations to SARS about your South African sourced income. The next myth is that only citizens of South Africa can be tax residents in South Africa.
Again, so this is incorrect. So even foreign nationals who are coming to South Africa, if they're making South Africa their permanent home, then they would have tax obligations in South Africa and can become tax resident. And again, vice versa, just even if you relinquish your South African citizenship, does not mean that your tax residency ceases. So once I'm non-resident, I can't return to South Africa without any tax consequences.
So this one is a yes and no. So it's part true, part not. So think of it this way. You can absolutely return to South Africa to visit or live again if you do break your tax residency. Returning to reside and live in South Africa again, that will absolutely trigger tax consequences. You'll become a tax resident again. Visiting might or might not, depending on how long you come for and what your intention is. So that's, again, something that you should consider and speak to a professional like ourselves to make sure you're compliant. All right, this is a biggie, probably the biggest misconception that we get from around the world is SARS won't find me when I'm abroad.
Yeah, and I think we get this often. Reality is SARS will find you abroad, whether, maybe not in the next 5 years, 10 years, but they will find you abroad. SARS has recently launched an expat specific team that's targeting expats. If you haven't let them know that you have left South Africa with no intention to return, they've got every right to believe that you are tax resident and you run these systems. There is a specific government system that allows all of these authorities to speak to each other.
Hey, not holding a South African passport means I am tax non-resident. So for those of you that have given up your green number and you think you're safe from SARS, you don't have to do anything with it. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Citizenship and so your citizenship, your passport holding, that has to do with Home Affairs, and tax residency has to do with SARS. They're not mutually exclusive. So if you break the one, doesn't mean you necessarily break the other. All right, so now busting some of those myths and clarifying a little bit, we're hoping in the webinar to explain to you why and how all of this works. And you'll hopefully understand a little bit better about how tax residency is determined in South Africa. What makes you a resident or non-resident? What does it mean? What do double taxation agreements mean? How do you apply those? What is the process to break your tax residency? What is the exit tax that is commonly known as that? What are some of the challenges that expatriates face abroad, and how can you make your living abroad be compliant with SARS, and also maybe even bring up some benefits that come along with it? And then finally, we'll also discuss how your retirement vehicles and inheritance are treated once you leave South Africa. All right, so Erin, I think, right, we always get clients confusing what tax residency actually means. Even the myth that you spoke about earlier and that we spoke about, that people think your passport has something to do with your tax. It's not necessarily the case in South Africa, but there is such a system. So what I want to do is first explain to everyone what is a tax system and how it's looked at in the types of systems that exist around the world. A residency-based tax system is pretty much 99%, or 98% maybe of the world. It's where you are either a tax resident or a tax non-resident, and that has to do with your revenue service provider. So it has to do nothing to do with your passport. It has to do with SARS, for example. The citizenship-based tax system There's only two countries in the world that still use this system, which is the United States and Eritrea. Now, for those countries, if you hold that passport and you leave the country, you're still liable for tax there as well. So that has to do with your citizenship. If you give up the US passport, then you're no longer taxed in that country as well. The last tax system that exists is source-based tax system. And South Africa used to be this back in the day before 2001. There's countries like Thailand, Panama, the Caymans, they tax you pretty much only on your sourced base. So anything based from that country, any income that you earn from that country is the only thing they consider and ask you to declare and tax you on that. Okay, South Africa, we are a residency-based tax system. So tax residents, so if you're a tax resident, you are legally required to declare your worldwide income to SARS, so both local and foreign, and then claim any tax credits or things like that, and you pay tax on what you're due. A non-resident, however, is only liable to declare and pay tax on local sourced income, so for anything from South Africa only. So that's the major difference between the two. There's obviously a lot more intricacies that go into it, but that's the major parts that you need to consider. Now, the way South Africa is a little bit different compared to other tax residency systems is that the burden of proof, so the responsibility to evidence and show and formalize and change anything falls onto the taxpayer themselves. It's not the responsibility of SARS to automatically change your status, tell you how to file, tell you what's right or wrong. It's their responsibility to collect. So our responsibility as a taxpayer is to then do everything else right. Whether we know how to or not, that's where we get the advice of professionals, but it is our responsibility to evidence, formalize, and do things like that. So the reason I'm telling you this is because nothing automatically changes. So even if you met the criteria to break your residency to become tax non-resident, even if you've left a million years ago, you're in the right countries that have the right agreements, you meet all the criteria, that we've done the right things. If you've not formalized it, if you've not told them and changed it and evidenced it, it does not matter. You're still going to be seen as a tax resident. Okay.
So South Africa works on a two-part residency system. So our first test is around your ordinarily residence, and this is a subjective test. So the burden of proof, as Victoria says, lies on you. Any sort of documentation or evidence will lie on you. So this is defined by SARS as a place that you're going to return to after your wanderings, and there's no time frame. So you could be gone for 5, 10, 15, even 30 years. If SARS believes that you're going to return to South Africa after your time abroad, then they will tax you in South Africa as a taxpayer and grab all of your worldwide income, and you'll have a tax liability in South Africa. When looking at this subjective test, SARS will often look at your intention. So when you left originally, what was your intention to go over to your new country? And if your intention was to permanently reside in that new country, then SARS wants to see evidence of such. Other factors that SARS will look at is how long you're spending in these other jurisdictions, where your personal interests and your business interests. They'll start to look at memberships like medical aid, golf memberships. Often we have people who have extended travel insurance, or often whilst people may be going to a first world country, they're on waiting lists for hospital treatment. And so they keep their medical aid in South Africa and return to South Africa for those treatments. And I think it's so important to say that you can still have those things in South Africa. But what we want to see on a scale is we want to see your other country, your new country, we want to see that weight heavier and showing SARS that the proof is that your new life is actually abroad and there's no ties back to South Africa. SARS can
That's a very good point, Erin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And SARS can
people always think, oh, I can't have things there, but you can. You absolutely can.
Yeah. And SARS can scrutinize it so much. I mean, they can go look at your Facebook page. They can look at so much detail. There are specific units targeting this. So it's such a vital thing to remember and so important. Yeah, and they can look at how long you're coming back to South Africa. What is your reason for coming back to South Africa? And so they can really go into such detail in regard to this.
What was that famous case that was recently, well, a few years ago now, that the gentleman with the golf membership in South Africa?
Yep. So this gentleman, he left South Africa. He did everything correctly in terms of notifying South Africa. They did do an investigation against him in terms of his residency status, and they found that he had a golf membership active in South Africa. And they used that to tie him back to South Africa. And unfortunately, he lost the case and he was required to pay tax on his worldwide income. And SARS didn't allow him to backdate that residency application.
Yeah, so for this ordinarily residence test, which is the first test, like you said, it can get quite in depth, and there's so many factors that go into it. But it's what you weigh up, exactly like you said, which one kind of outweighs which jurisdiction. Let's move on to the second test, which comes about. So if you don't meet the criteria, you meet criteria of the first test, then we move on to the second one, and that is the physical presence test. This one is a lot more black and white, let's say, because it's not with so many factors. It's literally to do with the number of days you're physically present in South Africa. You can see on the screen, it's an end test. So if the first criteria of the 91 days, then the second criteria with the 91 days in the last 5 years of tax years. There's a 330-day part of it that comes in. I'm not going to go too deeply into it because it can get very confusing. But this is literally a count of days of how much time you're spending in South Africa. So it is very important to calculate this correctly because it does get confusing. Now, the thing that I always tell clients that are leaving South Africa to take out of this test is that 91 number. So try to remember 91, not the 183 that we busted earlier. That's to do with something completely different. Think of the 91 days. So when you leave South Africa, that first year after you break your tax residency, try to not come back to South Africa for more than 91 days, because what it does is it resets that 5-year cycle if you don't come back to 91 days. And that's what would break this test. That's what make you also count as non-resident. So just try to remember that if possible. However, like I said, get a professional, come to us. We can help you do the calculation, ensure that you're doing this correctly. I mean, I'll show you now on the next slide how SARS, so this is straight from SARS' interpretation notes on how to do the test. And you can see there's not even really many numbers here. There's a whole lot of paragraphs and words on this flow chart. It can get so complex. I mean, if you look at the gray parts in the middle, it's how do they even count a day? What constitutes a day? So if you look, they can say, how long is the person in transit, you know, for example. So they're not even coming through, but they're passing through South Africa. Them being in transit, does that count as them being in South Africa? Does it not? Have they entered through a port of entry? Have they, you know, is there 2 places that they're coming from and going to? It can get quite complex. I mean, some other jurisdictions, Erin, I think, is it the UK that counts? It's not even a 24-hour cycle. It's
Yeah, so it gets so confusing. Some people cut off the day at 10 p.m. You know, some people start from midnight. It's so confusing. And whilst Victoria said it's such a black and white test, there's so many gray elements to it. And so definitely seek advice around it. And we recently had a case with regards to this 91 day where someone ceased their residency last year, well, in this tax year, the 2024 tax year, and they're wanting to come back to South Africa now, and they've booked a holiday for over a 3-month period. And in this specific circumstance, it was easier for her to just reduce her holiday period, not to come back for the 91-day period, which was easier for her. But often in these circumstances, you can't actually do that. Often you have to return to South Africa, and it's inevitable that you're going to have to look at these tests year on year. And it's just about going through the process of assessing those tests to make sure that you are declaring your tax in the correct jurisdiction, or if necessary, applying the double taxation agreements or other reliefs that are possible.
absolutely. And like you said, it's very important this test is considered. But like you said, this lady, she was able to change her days. That was lovely. A lot of people need to come back, be it to renew their visa, be it for a work project. I mean, I had a client who was in the States for 13, 15 years already, and his job had seconded him to South Africa for the next 4 or 5 years on a project before then they would come back to live in the United States. And for him, he would be breaking the physical presence test. I mean, the ordinary residence test could be come into question. You know, he was so worried that now will he become a tax resident again, even though his intention isn't to stay in South Africa permanently. And we can help with things like that. We absolutely helped them in that case. You know, his wife, his kids came along, and and we showed SARS, we proved it, we pulled out the legislation, we showed that they're not back permanently, they're just here for this. So even though they're breaking the test or meeting the criteria for the test to be tax resident, it's not necessarily the case. So when it comes to anything different out of the 91 days, speak to us. Let's find out. Let's figure it out for you. Let's show it to SARS. Make sure that they're aware, because like I said, the burden of proof is on you. You just have to make them aware of things. Okay, so in summary, the two tests, ordinarily residence test and physical presence test. So let's move on to now the other myth, which is the double taxation agreements that exist, Erin. I think that's often a thing that I get asked is, well, told is, there is a double taxation agreement. I'm safe. It's really nothing to worry about. I'm not going to be double taxed. Is that true?
Yeah. No, I think, yeah, contrary to the name, double tax agreement doesn't necessarily mean you won't pay tax in both jurisdictions. It just protects you from paying double, and not necessarily double in figures, but protects you from paying tax in both of the jurisdictions
The
on
same
both your
tax,
income.
yes.
You'll get relief, but you might have to pay some tax in another country as well. And so we can go through this double taxation agreement, but just if you have thought, okay, there's a double taxation agreement in place, I'm safe. Just to note that South Africa only has double taxation agreements with 53% of the world. So there's a lot of countries where there are no tax agreements in place. And so that's where you'd have to fall to other reliefs and other agreements to see where you would pay your tax. So essentially, going into this double taxation agreement, we spoke about the local laws test, which is that ordinary residence test, and the physical presence test from a residency perspective and tax residency perspective in South Africa. If you meet those two tests, or one of those tests, then you'd be grabbed as a tax resident in South Africa. Now, if you go to another country, and this specific section or this double taxation agreement is between South Africa and the United Kingdom, and it's just one small part of the double tax agreement, and this is the residency section. If you go to the UK and you meet the residency test by the local laws there, so just quickly, it's 183 days would spark residency there from a tax perspective. So if you're now in the UK for more than 183 days, and now you also meet the tests in South Africa, and this generally happens in your first year of exit, what happens is you have to go to the double taxation agreement to identify where your tax residency lies. So you forego those local law tests and you follow the tiebreaker test in the double tax agreement. So if we were to go through these points, the first point says, where do I have a permanent home available? Now, if you can answer that question quite clearly, then that would be your tax residency system. And you would then follow the UK. If you can quite clearly say, I've only got a home in the UK, that's where I'm tax resident. And then you would have your obligations in the UK, and that's your reporting country.
Erin, just before we go on, if we're going to explain just for the audience, what is meant by a permanent home? I think for us tax practitioners, it's easy to understand and the lingo is always there, but let's break it down a little bit.
Yeah, exactly that. Thanks, Victoria. And we read this legislation all day, every day. We understand the tax jargon and terminology. So forgive us if we speak of something, that you don't understand. Just pop it in the chat box. We're happy to go through it as well. But to tax practitioners like us, it's very familiar, and we're doing it every day. But in terms of this permanent home, it doesn't necessarily mean if you hold the title deeds. You might have investment property in South Africa that you've got the right to use. You might have your parents in South Africa where you've got a permanent home available. So you've got to be quite careful with what SARS would regard as a permanent home. And if you can't answer it, so you now have this permanent home in South Africa available to you as well as the UK, then you'd have to go to point B. And point B says, where am I habitually abode? And that would be, where are you spending majority of your time? Now, often in year one, when you leave, you don't make a clear cut, not everyone makes a clear cut at the end of the tax year and then they move. It's often sometimes in the middle of the tax year, also bearing in mind that all countries have different years of taxing. So it can get quite complex. So if you can't answer this question and you're spending equal amount of time or close to equal time in both of the countries, then you'd move to point C, which is around your nationality. If you hold dual nationality, then you have to move to point D. And in all of Victoria and our years doing this, which is over 20 years, we have never come to point D. But ultimately, if you do come to point D, then the authorities would get involved and they would then, by mutual agreement, decide where you are tax resident and where your tax burden lies.
Thank you, Erin. Okay, let's move on to the famous exit charge, or maybe not so famous. So let's break it down. When you do break tax residency, when you cease tax residency, when you financially immigrate, tax immigrate, that's all the terms that, you know, come about in the market that this is actually known as. But when essentially you become tax non-resident, when you formally apply to do this, what happens is it sparks a deemed disposal capital gains tax, which is known as the exit tax. Now, this is probably the most negative part about seizing your tax residency, because obviously the good parts are that you can protect your foreign income. You can have all these other benefits that we'll discuss a little bit later on. But the negative is that there is this exit charge that happens. Basically, what they look at is your worldwide capital assets, and they see at the day before you seize your tax residency, what is the capital gain on them? If there is any capital gain, then you pay gain up until that point. Then your new base costs become as of that date. Now, that seems daunting, but let's break it down a little bit further. It's not because it's just a greedy system. You know, it does seem very unfair that this would happen to you. Why am I paying tax on something I haven't even sold? It's a fake sale and fake requirement. Why is this happening? The reason they do this is when you become tax non-resident, you're no longer going to be liable for capital gains tax in South Africa on anything except for South African property. So every capital gain tax that you're going to pay one day when you actually dispose of these assets, even South African assets, is going to be now taxed in your new jurisdiction if there's a capital gains tax in those countries. So that's one benefit, that the countries might have a lower capital gains tax, they might not have any capital gains tax. So what SARS is saying, whilst you were tax resident here, whatever gain you made is technically ours. So that's why that comes about. Now, let's see what is included and not included. South African property is excluded. Okay, so that's a very important one to note. It's not included in this exit tax. And the reason for this is that it's the only thing that they can charge capital gains tax on again once you sell it. Okay, things like bank accounts, personal use assets, retirement annuities, those are excluded. What they do look at is the capital assets. So foreign property, very important, that will be considered. Shares, trusts, certain trusts, not all trusts, cryptocurrency, stocks, bonds, collectibles, any kind of capital gaining assets, both local and foreign. I think we've had quite a few clients that tax plan around this. That's the one benefit. You can absolutely make this use this to your advantage. So you can decide on your date of exit and when this will be triggered, depending on what assets you have, when the gain was, when you can prove the correct exit as well. Erin, I think you had a client that had some gold, I think, that he was going to.
Yeah, I think one of the awful things about this exit charge is, and I hate to talk to clients about this because it's basically saying pay tax for something that you haven't received money for. It's, you fake selling your assets, and so it's such a horrible thing to then tell people, we know you're going abroad, we know your rand value is not so great in your new country, but you know PS paid SARS some tax, so it's so awful. But in this specific case, someone had gold and had a big capital gain, and it created a large tax liability. So in their circumstances, they actually had to physically sell the gold to get those funds in order to settle that liability with SARS. It's not always a case, you know, you can plan around these things, but in this circumstance, yep, they had to actually physically sell their assets in order to meet that tax liability.
Yeah. And I think I want to remind everyone that it's your gain at that time. So if those be backdating as well, if you only bought foreign assets after you left and you backdate, you can exclude those from this exercise, you know, so you can be smart about this. If you know you're going to acquire certain assets, or at a certain point there was such a gain, or you know that there was a loss perhaps maybe during COVID, you know, you can try to plan to align your exit with that loss. So do speak to a professional when it comes to this. You know, it's very important to get this right.
Yeah, thanks, Victoria. And I think we've got a polling question now just around the exit charge and what you feel would potentially form part of the exit charge. So we have them up here, and then just Victoria, while everyone's answering that, I think let's chat about some other things that are not listed here. I mean, things that you would never think of. What about, let's say I have a racing horse in South Africa. What about that?
That's a good one. So a horse, just by itself, might not be considered as a capital asset, even though it is quite costly. However, the second you make it a racing horse, I mean, that's an investment that can gain in value. It can be used to be traded. So then that will be considered a capital asset and would form part of this exit tax.
Yeah.
What about things like a timeshare? I mean, that's another one that we
Yeah.
recently got to have a look at. That's very confusing because one, it's property, one, it's
Yeah.
not. How would we even?
Yeah, and then I suppose at the same time, I mean, it's personal use. Would that be included? Would it even be considered a gain? Have you purchased that timeshare to potentially make a gain? Would it be potential trading income? So I mean, there's so many factors to this. It's just, the net of this exit charge is so wide, and I think often people don't realize that something they may hold could potentially form part of this charge, which is what is the scary thing.
Yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
going to end the poll now, and let me share the results for everyone. So we've got no one thinking a trust forms part of it. This is one of
Interesting.
the awful things. Some trusts form part of this exit charge, which creates, this is one of the things that creates the biggest tax burden and the biggest implication about your date of exit is if you hold a trust in South Africa, if you don't know what type of trust you hold, then definitely seek professional advice. If you take anything away from today, it's that. If you've got a trust in South Africa, seek that
And abroad.
professional advice.
Foreign
Yeah.
trust as well. Yeah.
Foreign trust as well. It's so important because it does fall within the net of the exit charge. And we've got some people saying motor vehicles. So motor vehicles fall outside the net of exit charge, personal use asset. No one selected art. Unfortunately, art would fall under the net of the exit charge. Property, foreign property would. So if you have acquired foreign property and you haven't informed SARS, then generally we would advise you to backdate to the date your original exit out of South Africa. But the South African property would fall outside of the net because South Africa still has the taxing rights no matter when you sell. Gold falls within the net of the exit charge. Unfortunately, you'd have to pay tax on that. And then rightly shares, whether they're in a private company, listed company, shares would fall within the net of that exit charge as well.
Thank you, Erin. Let's move on.
Great. Thanks, Victoria. So we're going to move on to the challenges that are faced by expatriates. And as I said in the myth busting, SARS has specific expat divisions. This is a specific scenario about someone who's left South Africa and has gone to the United Kingdom. Currently, if you want to get a sponsorship visa in the UK, then the annual salary is at around about 30,000, set to increase to about £33,000 in this upcoming tax year. So even those who are on sponsorship visas, you'll be able to see the impact of what this has if you haven't notified SARS. And I think I just want to stress that if you haven't told SARS you've left, they've got every single right to believe that you are a taxpayer in South Africa, and they will tax you on your worldwide income. So in this scenario, just to put things into numbers for you, in this case, we've got someone who's earning around about £27,300, so equates to around about 612,000 Rand per year. If we apply the various taxing rates in the UK and South Africa, we'll see after applying the exchange rate, we'll see from a UK perspective, we're sitting at roughly around, I think it's about £3,000. I think we're going back. Oh, there we go. Roughly around about £3,000 in the UK of tax that you would pay annually. So that equates to roughly 66,000 Rand. Now, UK's got the taxing right on this UK employment, so they would tax you first. If you've left South Africa and you've informed SARS, lucky you, you've got no further obligation in South Africa. If you haven't told SARS you left, unlucky you, you've got taxing implications in South Africa. Now, the tax on an equivalent income of this is around about double, so you'd pay around about £6,300 in South Africa. Now, you've got a double taxation agreement between these two jurisdictions. So luckily, what happens in this case is you get a credit for the £3,000 that you would have paid in the UK. But the bad news is you would still have round about a 70,000 Rand shortfall in South Africa, and SARS would require you to pay that 70,000 Rand in South Africa. So just completely busting that myth of the double tax agreement. It protects you because you're allowed a credit, but you're essentially going to pay double tax on this income. And this is all because SARS has not been notified of your exit out of South Africa.
Yeah, and I mean, the numbers are staggering. And if you think about it, the higher you earn, the more this gets complex and the higher you probably pay.
Exactly. And when Victoria and I were preparing for this webinar, I said to her, I really don't want to mention this because I hate scare tactics. I hate scaring people with this, but it is a reality. And we've had people who've left South Africa, who haven't informed SARS, who have left their tax affairs open in South Africa, and who have come back to the border. And as they've entered South Africa, they've been issued summons on their outstanding debt. And yeah, it's not a nice thing, but it's reality and it happens. And I think also not paying SARS or not informing SARS of changes to your particulars is a criminal offense. And Victoria can speak a bit about what it means from a visa implication.
Absolutely. So don't even changing your address and notifying them of the correct address can be a criminal offense. You know, having outstanding debt is a criminal offense, you know, which is probably how you get caught as well. Just having a criminal offense on your record can impact those visas that you get to go abroad. And, you know, a lot of people don't have the citizenship yet or things like that. So it might even just force you to have to come straight back to South Africa, you know, with a massive extra bill as well and a criminal offense. So meanwhile, we're not trying to scare people. Sadly, that is the reality. It does happen. It is there. It's going to catch you out. Like we said earlier, you cannot put your head in the sand. You cannot hide from SARS. But taking it back a little bit, I think, let's talk about the benefits of this. I think that's the important part. There is absolutely things you can do. And if you do them correctly, you can not only protect yourself from these scary things, but you can actually also benefit and get extra savings or extra perks. I think, Erin, let's begin on that. Let's go into the next topic.
Yeah, so I think we're going to move on to less somber stuff and going to move on to some great reliefs. This is a fantastic relief and it is not used at all. There are absolute great benefits here, and it's all about that double taxation agreement. It's got a lot of tax jargon, but there's a lot of savings if an agreement does exist between the jurisdiction that you are going to and South Africa. So in this specific example, we're going to just chat about withholding tax. Now, withholding tax is a final tax. So what it means is essentially, think of it as your salary when you're in South Africa. Your employer would have withheld PAYE. It's the same concept here. They withhold the tax and they pay you out the net amount. What it means in this scenario is it's a final tax. So no matter what the tax is, there's no further tax unless it's less than the jurisdiction that you're in. But what this means here, and this little snippet here is from the double taxation agreement, and this is between South Africa and Australia. So in this scenario, what we have here is we've got someone who's left South Africa, they're in Australia, and they've got some dividends from a South African company. So as a non-resident, that company will withhold 20% tax because that's the tax on dividends, and then you'd get your net amount. So you'd get your 80%. Now, if you were to read the double taxation agreement will tell you what's the limit that you can apply. And in this scenario, it's 15%. So what someone can do is make an application to SARS, just show this information from the double taxation agreement. SARS issues you with a letter that lets that company know that the dividends withholding tax will not exceed 15%. Now, if you do that, there's no further tax in South Africa and there's no further tax in Australia. So you've saved yourself a 5%. Now, this is just one specific scenario and one specific income type. This pertains to interest, royalties, or if you've got property in South Africa and you're selling that, it also pertains to that. And some of these agreements show as little as 8%. So you could be making up to a 12% tax saving on your income in South Africa.
I mean, that's huge, Erin. I mean, if you put it into numbers, out of, 100,000, 500,000 Rand, R1 million, 12% of that is huge if you can save that. And, not paid it unnecessarily to the taxman when you don't have to. I think another perk, there's so many perks to being non-resident. One of them that always, our South Africans love abroad, especially those with family in South Africa, is that there's no donations tax applicable to non-residents. That means you can send your mom, uncle, sister, kids, whoever you've got left in South Africa, as much money as you want. And there's no donations tax. I mean, donations tax in South Africa is 100,000 per annum that you can gift as an individual. But if you're non-resident, there's no cap to that. There'll be no tax. So that's also another wonderful interest. You can avoid having to pay interest on tax on interest. There's lots of perks that come with it. Besides, obviously, the biggie, protecting your foreign income from SARS.
Yep, exactly that. And it's just about reading these agreements in place and analyzing all the reliefs available.
Great. Speaking of benefits, one of the other ones that exists has to do with retirement policies. Now, up until a few years ago, it was the case that you can withdraw your retirement annuity in full early once you've broken your tax residency, so once you become tax non-resident. Now, in South Africa, when you're tax resident, you can only withdraw a third once in your lifetime before maturity, so before you retire, and then the rest of the 2/3 upon retirement only. This, being a non-resident, allows you to withdraw it early in full. However, one of the changes, that this expat division of SARS has made is that now they've put a cap of 3 years on it. So you have to be tax non-resident for 3 years before you can make use of this benefit. Yes, it does put a timeline on it. However, it's still wonderful benefits and you can make use of it. It's not to say that you don't have to, though, that you have to. You can absolutely keep the retirement funds. You can keep donating into them, putting money in. You can stop putting money in. You can do whatever you really have to with it. But you have to remember that you're 3 years non-resident. So a tip that I would give all of you is if you can backdate, if you've left 5 years ago, even 2 years ago, backdate your date of exit if you had that intent already back then, because it already buys you those 2 years out of the 3. It's really wonderful, but I think I want to show you guys these tax tables at the bottom of the screen. It's another consideration. Yes, it's lovely to pull it out right away, but just be aware that there's tax implications as well. If you wait until maturity, you have 500,000 tax-free that you can withdraw. Okay, and then you start paying tax at 18%, 27%, and 36%. If you withdraw early, you only have 27,500 Rand that will be tax-free. So that's quite a significant amount. But a lot of clients, the decision making has nothing to do with this most of the time. It has to do with what they need it for. So a lot of people will say, you know what, I don't know in 30, 20, 10 years what the exchange rate will look like. Will that be enough for me to live abroad? Or they say, you know what, I want to keep it in South Africa because the interest rate is great. So it gains in value more that way. So it's a very personal decision, but it is there for you to make use of should you wish. Okay. The other thing I think we want to speak about a little bit is inheritance. So when you live abroad and you happen to receive inheritance in South Africa, to be able to receive it abroad, you have to have put your immigration, so broken your tax residency in place formally with SARS. You have to show that paper that you're non-resident to be able to have those funds released to you. We've had it so many times that clients come and they need this paper. They didn't even think they had an obligation. They didn't even think they had to. And now it's retrospectively, we have to go back and correct this and prove it. And it adds that other 2, 3, 4, 5 months, however long it is, adds that administrative burden of paperwork, everything to have to deal with when you're already dealing with quite a difficult emotionally situation as it is. I think another tip, Erin, we can give our viewers today is perhaps about wills. What would you say?
Yeah, so for wills, we suggest, whilst it's not legal, but we do suggest that if you've got assets in different jurisdictions outside of South Africa, is just ensure that you've got a will in each country that you have assets. It just makes for such an easier thing to deal with on your death from an inheritance tax perspective as well. And it's just really just safeguarding those assets as well. So just a good tip there. And just another one in terms of this retirement, and we see this all the time, legislation changes all the time, and specifically with expats, SARS loves to change things up. and a new rule is coming around retirement. It is coming in now in March. So just to put it in quite layman terms, essentially it's changing this 3-year residency status. It's just increasing it to around about 6 years. It's called a 2-part system. So have a look up on it, or reach out to us, and we're more than happy to explain what it means from a retirement perspective and how to access those funds.
Great. Let's move on to another hot topic that comes with leaving South Africa, which is moving funds out of South Africa, remitting funds. Now, as a tax resident, you have that single discretionary allowance of R1 million per calendar year. Anything above that, then you need a SARS clearance application, which is now called the Approval International Transfer, the AIT. Erin, I have a question so that the viewers can understand a little bit better. What constitutes as that 1 million? Is it just what you kind of say, okay, from my bank account, transfer this to abroad?
No, I think, and you can get to this 1 million so quickly, but, even holidays abroad, when you're swiping your South African card, that constitutes part of your 1 million. Shopping online, if it's from an overseas company, it constitutes part of your million. So you can get up to that amount quite quickly.
Yeah, with exchange rates as well, I think it's not. So just be cognizant of where you are. Look, your bank can always tell you, so reach out to your bank. They can tell you what you've spent abroad as well. Now let's speak about what happens when you're non-resident. So when you break your tax residency in South Africa, the good news is that there's no limit of what you can take out of South Africa, be it 1 million, 2 million, 10 million, 40 million, however it is, they cannot stop you. You do, however, need that clearance from SARS from cent 1. So basically you apply for this AIT, the clearance certificate, for any amount you want to transfer out of the country. It's a quick process. And basically our advice, tax tip, call it, that we want to give everyone is you apply for it for a year. So you apply for, if you've got the funds liquid, apply for as much as you can for that certificate once off. It just stops you from having to apply it for every time you want to transfer during that calendar year. So it's something that you can just keep in your pocket and keep going. But yeah, that's how remittance of funds works. The other only note is that with grey listing and everything going on, anything above 10 million rand, you have to also get a reserve bank clearance. Again, it's not a difficult thing to do. You just have to prove your source of funds, get the correct BOP codes, things like that. But you do need that clearance from SARS and the Reserve Bank to do so. Great. Now let's talk about how we can help you. We've discussed all these topics. We've busted a lot of myths, a few confusions. So we can help you in a multifaceted aspect of things. Anything to do with tax, anything to do with any other jurisdiction, anything accounting wise, we can help you. But specifically around this area, let's see, we've got a tax health check. Basically, we look at your tax profile and we'll dive in and make sure that everything is compliant. Or we have a look at what isn't compliant, or what's the next step you need to take to perhaps break your tax residency, or apply the double tax agreement, or maybe claim a tax relief for your foreign income, or whatever the case might be. We do things like a tax residency opinion. We can just prove and show, according to legislation and the residency tests, where you're tax resident. And we can do this not just for South Africa, we can do this for other tax jurisdictions around the world as well. We can help you break your tax residency. We can help you apply to move funds abroad. We really can do a multifaceted amount of things. I think what we want to offer you from this webinar is a free 15 minutes, no obligation assessment. Book with us, come chat to us. There's no obligation to join for any service or anything like that, or even do anything with us, but at least get informed on what your situation is and perhaps what the next step might be. I think, Erin, we've got quite a few social media channels that you can subscribe to, from Instagram, Facebook, all of these things. There's I think, a Tax Tip Tuesday. There's always a nice tax tip that happens. And then we actually got a nice webinar series, if you want to chat a little bit about that, coming up as well.
Yeah, we've got a 10-part webinar series coming up. It's impossible to go into detail around every aspect today in the webinar about things. So it's a 10-part series that takes you through applying a double tax agreement, inheritance, retirement. And so they're all mini little workshops. You don't have to sign up for the whole thing. You can pick and choose. and then we'll have some great discussions in there with everyone who's abroad in different jurisdictions. And we're looking to do a breakout session as well in different countries for people, so you can meet other people who have got similar issues that you may have as well.
Wonderful. So yeah, please keep an eye out for those things coming up. I think let's move on to questions.
Great.
Let's see what's in the chat box.
Perfect. All right. So the first one is, do you have to meet both the ordinarily test and physical presence test to be deemed non-resident for tax? I think Nolan at the bottom answered this one. He says, my understanding is that it is either one or the other. It could be both, but only where a taxpayer is not ordinarily resident would you then need to apply the physical presence test to establish the taxpayer is deemed resident. So start with the ordinarily test. That's correct. So ultimately, when you're breaking your tax residency, you've got to start at that ordinarily test. If your intention is to be out of South Africa, if you meet all of those criteria, then you would move on to the physical presence test. If you meet that test, doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot break your residency. There are other days tests that we would have to apply, and you can still backdate it to the day that you actually left South Africa. If a double taxation agreement is in place, then we would obviously have to look at that, to look at the tiebreaker test in that DTA. Second question I'll pose to you, Victoria. If we are immigrating but have small liabilities in South Africa, we are still paying off in order to close accounts, example, a credit card. What implications will ceasing my residency have on those accounts, and can we still notify SARS prior to immigrating?
That is a very good question. So prior to 2021, I think it was, when the Reserve Bank was involved in this process, it was not allowed to actually immigrate to break your tax residency if you had liabilities in South Africa. Basically, your assets had to outweigh your liabilities to be allowed to do this. Luckily, they've dropped this. Now you can have liabilities, you can have loans, you can apply for new loans, you can apply for a home loan. Doesn't matter, you can still now seize your tax residency. What happens is it's just really a declaration when we do an application. We do list your assets and liabilities in South Africa, so that SARS is aware of what you have. There's no limit on it, though. It doesn't stop you from doing this process. So absolutely, you can absolutely immigrate. It does, perhaps the way your bank will handle it. You might change the type of account, the name, or they might not give you extra credit on that specific credit card or something like that. But there's no, it doesn't prevent you from doing this process at all.
Great, thanks, Victoria. Another question is around, I was under the impression that even though you can prove you've ceased to be non-tax resident in South Africa for 3 years, that STARS still applies the withdrawal table. Right, yeah, so that's correct in terms of that. So currently this is the process now, just bearing in mind that from March it does change. But essentially, if you've proved to SARS that you've got 3 years of non-tax residency in South Africa, you can then pull your retirement. If you are under retirement age, you will be taxed at the punitive rate. So that's where only the first 27,500 is tax-free, and then the specific taxing sliding scale will apply. If you prove your non-residency for 3 years, you have the option to pull it, but you can also not pull it and keep it in South Africa. You'd still apply the tax tables on withdrawal if you pull it after retirement age. It's just not as punitive. So you've got the first 500,000 tax-free.
Yeah, so to clarify, it depends on whether you're retirement age or not if you've immigrated or not.
Yeah, and South Africa retains a taxing right on that RA or on that pension or provident or preservation fund. So you would always pay that tax in South Africa and then declare it in your other jurisdiction and get.
I have another tax tip for these guys though on that. If there is a double taxation agreement, you can actually request to be taxed in your other jurisdiction on your retirement vehicle. And save a little bit on tax if it's a lower tax table. But again, speak to a professional because it can get quite complex on how to do that.
Great, thanks, Victoria. Another question is, as there is a double tax agreement and the tax rate in the UK is higher, could you clarify why there would still be tax payable to SARS on income earned in the UK? So in terms of this, there would be, if you are still South African tax residents, and so remember, even if your intention was to leave and you've met all the criteria, if you haven't notified SARS, they've still got every right to believe that you're tax resident. So in the scenario that we spoke about, this was a situation if someone didn't notify SARS, then they would have to report that income to SARS. Whilst the tax rate in the UK does seem like it's more, the way that those personal allowances and primary rebates, they apply differently. So it's not like for like taxing system. South Africa's got a sliding scale. The UK is slightly different in terms of that. So that's why there would be a shortfall in South Africa. And South Africa, in this case, comes out with a higher tax rate. The next one is the rate of tax on capital gains on shares the same rate as when doing a normal tax return? Victoria, do you want to take that one?
So yeah, so it would be the normal capital gains tax rate in South Africa. That's what they would use. Depending if the asset is foreign or not, that's the only thing that they probably then would consider the foreign currency value of that as well, into rand and convert it into rands. But it's the normal capital gains tax rate that they would use in South Africa.
All right. Okay, I think those are all the.
That's all the questions in the chat. Yeah. Anyone else have any questions? Anyone brave enough to put their camera on or chat to us a little bit?
I think just maybe another one, Victoria, is I suppose we often get this question as well, is why would I need to do this if I've left South Africa years ago? I've got nothing left here. You know, I don't work here. I don't have any ties. I don't plan to come back to South Africa. Why do I need to do this?
That's a good one. So whilst you think you don't have ties, go back to the ordinarily residence test. You know, if you were born here, you lived here, you've probably met that test. Meanwhile, you might not even have a tax number. You never worked here. You know, we get that a lot. I left straight after university or before even university, or I left with my parents earlier on. Do I have to do this? The answer is yes. Unfortunately, you might, even though you don't have a tax number, you are still might be considered tax resident and required to show your non-residency. It might be low risk, as we say, but low risk doesn't mean no risk.
Yeah. Thanks, Victoria. The other question,
Erin, yeah, sorry, I've got one for you, if you don't mind. The other question that I often get is, okay, you said that even as a tax non-resident, I'll still have to pay tax in South Africa and have liabilities on South African sourced income. When can I actually completely break up with SARS? When do I now cannot stop talking to them?
Yeah, so when essentially all your ties are cut. So when you don't believe that you're going to get an inheritance from anyone in South Africa, if you've got no assets in South Africa, if your ties are completely cut, then you can deregister from SARS. Often we have people leaving, and this brings me to this inheritance tax thing that I wanted to bring up, is often we have people leaving and they say, I've got nothing, I've got no assets, I want to deregister. And one of the first things we ask is there a potential that you could get an inheritance from South Africa? And if the answer is yes, don't deregister from SARS just yet. There are going to be implications in terms of getting those funds out of South Africa. You would need to report those to South Africa, even though it's not taxable. It is a reporting requirement. And then also from an inheritance tax perspective, and the importance of ceasing your tax residency in South Africa and breaking that tie with SARS is that both when you receive an inheritance and then when you also have an inheritance that you're leaving to your children or whoever, it's also important, if you are still considered a tax resident, there's going to be tax implications in South Africa on your worldwide income, and that's how the inheritance system works in South Africa as well.
Wonderful. I think that's a good place to round up the webinar. So thank you everyone for joining us.
We do have a couple more questions here, Victoria. Just will we have access to the recording? Yep, the recording is going to be sent along to everyone. We'll also send our link to book a 15-minute online, and so you will get all of that as well as these slides. Can you post the email address? Yes, we'll do that. We will send the 15-minute booking link, and then cool. I think that was everything. Great.
Wonderful. And remember, if you guys have anything and think of anything later, just pop us an email, book, chat to us. We're here to help.
Thanks, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.